From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
The Supreme Court rules Donald Trump has some immunity from prosecution for official presidential acts, effectively ensuring his Washington trial won't happen before the election.
We'll have reaction this hour from law professor Jessica Roth, and we'll assess the political ramifications with Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report.
He'll also weigh in on the fallout from last week's presidential debate. As Bloomberg reports, the DNC is considering formally nominating Joe Biden as early as mid-July, in part to stamp out chatter of him stepping out of the 2024 race.
Thanks for joining us here this Monday. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington here on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we begin with the decision from the Supreme Court today on presidential immunity. In a 6-3 ruling along ideological lines, the court said that Donald Trump has some immunity to criminal charges, sending the case back to federal district court. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts said the president enjoys no immunity for his unofficial acts, and not everything the president does is official. The president is not above the law, but Congress may not criminalize the president's conduct in carrying out the responsibilities of the executive branch under the Constitution.
Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote in dissent and said, in quote, "Today's decision to grant former presidents criminal immunity reshapes the institution of the presidency. It makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. With fear for our democracy," she ends, "I dissent." Let's bring in now Bloomberg's Greg Stohr, who covers the Supreme Court and therefore has been incredibly busy on this historic day. So, Greg, obviously this has implications directly for the prosecution of Donald Trump. But the court here today also potentially changed the course of the office of the presidency for the future.
Yeah, it sure did. In fact, it didn't really talk at all about, what specifically it means for whether or not a trial can go forward before the election this year. This ruling was all about the spheres of areas where the president should not have to worry, the court said, about the prospect of criminal prosecution. There are areas that the Constitution says are entirely within the president's power, like the pardon power. Can't be prosecuted for anything he does there. Other areas where it is still within the president's official authority, though perhaps not quite as exclusive as with the pardon power. And in those areas, there's a presumption against criminal prosecution. So it really walled off a lot of areas where the president can't be prosecuted.
So it appears there will not be time for Jack Smith to have his January 6th trial here in Washington before the election, as this is knocked down to a lower court and they try to determine what is official and what is not. In the meantime, what is the status of the sitting president of the United States? Is it good to be king?
It is, in the sense that if you want to be somebody who doesn't have to worry about criminal prosecution, yes. In terms of the trial, it is near certain it cannot happen this year. There's just not going to be enough time. In fact, this could be a process that takes I'm speculating here, but easily a year before a trial starts, just because Judge Chutkan is going to have to make a lot of rulings. Those rulings will go up on appeal, come back to the Supreme Court. All that will have to happen before there's a prosecution. And, of course, if Donald Trump wins the election, there won't be one.
Yeah, it can make the whole thing go away. To your point, though, on this idea that this could all come back to the Supreme Court anyway, why not rule today and directly say what constitutes an official act and what is a private act? Why wouldn't the justices make that decision for themselves?
Well, I think what they would say is we don't decide more than we have to. And, we want to let lower court judges take first crack at things before we jump in to decide them. They did say that there's some areas here that are off limits. For example, his conversations with people at the Justice Department. They said can't be prosecuted for that. Other areas, the court said, are going to require a district judge looking into the facts about the context of tweets he put out and the things he said in that speech at the Ellipse. And it's going to require more of a factual determination than has been done so far, and then the court left open the possibility that it can review that factual determination.
So it's likely then, since there is no real ruling today, it goes to the lower court and then eventually comes back to this court. Is that safe to expect?
Yeah, that is certainly possible. One thing they did make clear is that all this has to happen before a trial, that this is not a case. One of the things Jack Smith asked for as sort of a fallback argument was, hey, even if there's some stuff that we can't use, even if there's some official acts that you're saying can't be part of this case, let the district judge worry about that at trial. Let the trial go forward now. The court very clearly declined to do that and said this all has to be decided beforehand.
Helping us bring clarity to a very complex story, Greg Stohr, as always, we thank you covering the Supreme Court for us here at Bloomberg. And for more reaction to today's ruling, I spoke with constitutional law attorney Robert McWhirter today on Bloomberg Radio. He said everything changes if Donald Trump gets elected.
We could find ourselves with a president-elect on trial, but realize the moment he becomes president, he can shut the whole thing down. So presumably, if they could get in, before January of 2025, they could probably do it. But I don't even see how that happens.
Let's go now to Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson for the political side of this important legal story. Wendy, it's great to have you with us today. Donald Trump goes to Truth Social seconds after the ruling. Big win for our Constitution and democracy. Proud to be an American. Is he right, or is it a big win for Donald Trump?
It's a big win for Donald Trump, and I think it's still to be decided whether it's a big win for the Constitution or not. I mean, I was thinking earlier about Nixon and Watergate. And Nixon, there was that famous Saturday Night Massacre in which Nixon ordered the Attorney General to do something, I think fire the special counsel, and the Attorney General refused. So Nixon fired him, brought in the deputy. He refused. Nixon fired him. Would all of that which would be obstruction of justice in a civilian world, would all of that now be perfectly legal?
As an official act.
As an official act. And they even mentioned that an official act was Donald Trump going to Mike Pence and saying, I want you to go to Congress and not certify the election and say it was rigged, even though both Pence and Trump knew the election wasn't. And the Supreme Court today, I think, said that's okay, because that's an official act. It's really startling.
Well, and it's so much so that this has dominated the conversation here in Washington today, and perhaps in doing so has taken some heat off of President Biden after last week's debate performance. That certainly wasn't the case, though, on the Sunday show circuit, where this is something Democrats were asked a lot about yesterday, including Democratic Congressman from Maryland, Jamie Raskin, who spoke about the fallout from Biden's performance.
We're having a serious conversation about what to do. One thing I can tell you is that regardless of what President Biden decides, our party is going to be unified. Whether he's the candidate or someone else is the candidate, he is going to be the keynote speaker at our convention. He will be the figure that we rally around to move forward.
He described it as a serious conversation being underway, Wendy, and yet it doesn't seem that anyone in the Biden camp is looking to have that conversation. And in fact, we're reporting today the DNC is considering nominating him a month early.
Absolutely. And so there are lots of serious conversations happening in the Democratic world, among Democratic lawmakers, among thinkers, among what is derisively called the chattering class. But yes, apparently in the Biden family and in the White House, it is full steam ahead. This ruling today from the Supreme Court just shows how dangerous it is to elect Donald Trump. And they are just whistling past Thursday night into this thing. And just think for a moment, if Donald Trump decided to quietly and in a virtual meeting nominate himself, even if they announced it, nominate himself before the convention, I can just hear pearls dropping all over town as they're clutching it and saying, he's being a dictator, he's trying to take, subvert power. And from what our reporting is today, that's exactly what the Biden White House is doing. They're deciding to move up the date he is nominated to avoid this conversation.
This is incredible. So this would happen as soon as July 21st when the Credentials Committee meets. A virtual meeting.
And the convention is until August 15th.
That's right, Chicago. This is supposed to be the whole point of this exercise, making that even more of a showbiz event. But to your point, this is kind of the definition of a backroom deal, right? This is giving Donald Trump another excuse to call this rigged.
It is, even though, let's be fair, I mean, the delegates, the elected delegates are there. The delegates are pledged to Biden on the first vote. Yes, and that's the people said they wanted, Democratic voters at least said they wanted Joe Biden to be the nominee. And these delegates will vote for Biden. But moving it up avoids any time for anyone else to come in and say, hold up, let's see how you do. And I'm quite sure they'll keep him out of unscripted moments in the meantime.
Well, we should point out that Democrats apparently had already planned to nominate him before the convention so that he could make it on the ballot in Ohio. The deadline for that is August 7th. So potentially you could argue, or at least they could make the case that part of this is about ensuring that the president is on the ballot. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Now, coming up, we'll take a closer look at the Supreme Court's decision on immunity today with former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The bottom line is this decision is really meaningless in a lot of ways. None of the acts that are alleged in that indictment are official acts of the President of the United States. He's alleged essentially to get involved in the presidential election, to try and overturn it, trying to do things that have nothing to do with his powers under the U.S. Constitution.
Former Watergate prosecutor Nick Ackerman earlier today saying the Supreme Court's decision ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from prosecution for official acts might ultimately have little impact on his case, even if this does effectively mean it won't see a trial before the election. Joining us now for more on today's historic ruling is Jessica Roth, professor at the Cardozo School of Law. Professor Roth, thank you so much for being with us. Of course, this was a 6-3 ruling on ideological lines. They didn't say that he is immune entirely, as unofficial acts for a president are not protected. But what is your reaction to the ruling from the High Court?
Well, it was an extraordinary ruling in that it set forth a new proposition of law that had never before been stated in any opinion from the Supreme Court, namely that a president is entitled to immunity from prosecution for acts committed while in office. That is an entirely new statement from the Supreme Court. That said, the ultimate impact on the prosecution of Donald Trump in the special counsel's case brought in D.C. may not be all that much if the case is able to go forward on either the unofficial acts and or those official acts as to which Jack Smith can overcome the presumption of immunity that the court articulated here for official acts. There's going to be a huge impact on the timing of that case, though, because now the case goes back to the trial court to determine which acts are official and are not official, and for official acts, whether the presumption of immunity can be overcome. And then Trump would be able to appeal an adverse decision against him to the D.C. Circuit and then possibly back up to the Supreme Court. So in terms of timing, things just got pushed back even further in terms of this case ever going to trial. On the substance, on the merits, the ultimate impact may not be that grave.
Jessica, we heard from the spokesman for the White House counsel's office, Ian Sams, issued a very brief statement after the ruling, quote, as President Biden has said, nobody is above the law. But in fact, we learned otherwise today, didn't we? I realize this could take on some different contours in the lower court, and it's going to come back to the Supreme Court. But as of right now, if it's considered an official act, Joe Biden can do anything he wants.
Well, the Supreme Court majority opinion says that even for official acts, it's only, at least as of now, presumptively immune, that presumption could be overcome if a prosecutor could show that it would not intrude on the proper functioning of the executive branch to bring a prosecution for that allegedly criminal conduct. Although the court does take pains to say that at least for now, it's a minimum of presumptive immunity. It leaves open the door for the idea that that actually could be absolute immunity. So the court really sort of didn't commit to a position on that. But the majority opinion also said no person is above the law, and a president would not be above the law because they could be prosecuted for unofficial acts, and it left open the possibility of prosecution even for official acts where that presumption would be overcome. But certainly this opinion seems to make a president considerably more immune from prosecution than before this decision was handed down.
So, Jessica, in your personal reading of this, knowing that someone who could be president again in Donald Trump has talked about retribution if he gets back into the Oval Office, being a dictator on day one, that a question that came up in these arguments was whether or not a president could direct, say, SEAL Team 6 as the commander-in-chief to assassinate a political rival. Should we be concerned about the potential decisions that a second Donald Trump would be able to make as president under this ruling?
Yes, I think we should be very concerned about that, and the dissent highlighted that very colorfully and pointed out that on the dissent's reading of the majority opinion, a president would be immune from prosecution for undertaking such act. The majority opinion did not take a position explicitly on that hypothetical and really sort of took pains to say that the dissent was engaging essentially in fear-mongering and considering hypotheticals that were not presented and as to which the court had not ruled, and that those issues, if they ever were to arise, would be left for another day. So on the one hand, the majority's language and its opinion seems quite sweeping. It's hard to imagine how under that broad language, that hypothetical would not be covered by the immunity that the court articulated. But at the same time, the court then goes on to say, actually, our holding today is quite modest. We're holding that a president enjoys immunity for certain core acts within the powers entrusted to him by the Constitution. Here, that means communications with members of the Department of Justice about acts that they should undertake. And we really don't reach anything else in this opinion. And so it does need to be left for another day, sort of how that hypothetical would be resolved. Would it deem to be within the core functions of the president as entrusted to him by the Constitution, for example, as commander-in-chief? Would it be deemed to be outside of those core functions, but nevertheless an official act? Would it be an official act as to which there would be a presumption of immunity, but that presumption could be overcome? Or would it be deemed to be unofficial? So these are questions to be resolved if they ever arise on another day.
So we've established, Jessica, that Jack Smith is essentially out of time here when it comes to the January 6th trial as we knew it. Is there another approach for him? Is there another way for him to write charges that gets around this ruling today?
There's a lot of the conduct that's alleged in his January 6th indictment that I think is either clearly unofficial, and which Trump's lawyers conceded was unofficial at the oral argument before the Supreme Court, namely Trump's communications with private attorneys in connection with an effort to create false slates of electors, for example. That would be clearly unofficial, and Jack Smith could proceed on the basis of those allegations. And then there's a huge range of conduct that would be deemed to be possibly official, and the court parties would have to litigate whether that was official or not, namely Trump's communication with state officials. The question for Smith is how much does he want to pursue those acts that are possibly going to be deemed to be official? Does he want to pursue that in the trial court? Does he want to also pursue that even if they are official, that he can overcome the presumption that they're entitled to immunity? Does he want to litigate that all the way up the courts before ever getting to a trial? Or does he want to just slim down to things that are pretty unequivocally private acts? Does he think he can win his case, at least as to some of the charges, based solely on private acts? Those are the choices he's going to be thinking about now.
Be quite a development if he made a second pass at this. Jessica, thank you for being with us. Jessica Roth of the Cardozo School of Law with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, former Trump aide Steve Bannon's first day in prison. We'll have that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
to go to prison. If this is what it takes to stand up to tyranny, if this is what it takes to stand up to the Garland, corrupt, criminal DOJ, if this is what it takes to stand up to Nancy Pelosi, if this is what it takes to stand up to Joe Biden, I'm proud to do it.
Proud to do it. Longtime Trump advisor Steve Bannon earlier today, just moments before surrendering for a 4-month prison sentence. Supreme Court refusing to pause Bannon's incarceration for contempt of Congress. So here we are. Bannon now joining a long list of Trump aides or former Trump aides who have found themselves imprisoned. For more on this, Bloomberg's Josh Green joins us here in Washington, author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the storming of the presidency. Josh, it's great to see you. Welcome. Steve Bannon will be sent to a low-security federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut. Not exactly breaking rocks here. This is actually the place that was the inspiration for the institution featured in the Netflix series Orange is the New Black. Is this all up for him, politically speaking? Is going to make a bunch of money going through his podcast and other stuff when he gets out?
Well, I think you can judge from that clip. He's probably the happiest guy you've ever seen going into a federal prison sentence. Yes. I think part of it is that it's not a very long sentence, so maybe it isn't as scary. When he was first facing a jail sentence, 6 months, 8 months ago, I talked to one of his friends who said, if it's a short sentence, Steve is going to treat this like Nelson Mandela, like he's a political prisoner, and it will help to augment his brand. And I think that's exactly what we saw in the news conference and in the podcast stuff that Bannon's been putting out.
Yeah, so make himself a martyr in some sense. What's different, of course, is that Steve Bannon hasn't turned from Donald Trump in a way that others who have gone to prison for their affiliation with Trump, like, say, Michael Cohen, the star witness in his hush money trial.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Bannon views this, I think, almost in a Trumpian way as a branding opportunity to make himself, an ever more prominent ally of Donald Trump, of MAGA, and to kind of enhance his place in that media universe. His podcast, War Room, is very influential in setting a lot of the conservative storylines. It's helped to boost Bannon's profile after it collapsed when he was fired from Trump's White House in 2017, and is really something that's helped kind of drive the resurgence of Donald Trump and spread the different storylines that have been so important in the MAGA universe. And so Bannon has kind of fit himself into that narrative as another person he would claim who's wrongfully victimized by the Biden Justice Department.
So this is legitimizing for him in a lot of ways, obviously, then. Could you have imagined when you're writing the book watching him walk into prison like this?
I really couldn't. The first thought I had when I saw that the Supreme Court wasn't going to let him out of prison was, gosh, my title, Devil's Bargain, is more apt than I realized when we published the book in 2017 because, he partners up with Trump and here he is going off to jail. But I actually think you're right. I think he views this as a positive for himself and something that's going to help him and help Trump and help the MAGA movement going forward.
Amazing.
All right. Bloomberg's Josh Green, author of Devil's Bargain. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, still ahead, we'll talk with Charlie Cook of the Cook Political Report about the fallout from last week's presidential debate. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
The only Democrat who's ever beaten Donald Trump is Joe Biden. He is our candidate for November, and he has the best shot to beat him.
I'm with Joe Biden, and it's our assignment to make sure that he gets over the finish line come November, not for his sake, but for the country's sake.
We've got a lot of confidence and a lot of faith in President Biden. We love Joe Biden. He's been a magnificent president.
I'm sticking with him, and I do believe that the American people, the vast majority of the American people, will stick with him as well.
Just some of the public support that we've been hearing from Democrats following President Biden's challenge debate performance last week. On the other side of the aisle, not shy about calling for Joe Biden to leave the race. Here's Republican Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming on Fox News.
My concern right now, Maria, is not just all the Americans who watched this debate. It's what foreign leaders, our enemies, saw in that debate. In China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, right now, are they thinking this is our moment of opportunity? One is, do you replace him on the ticket? And the other is, do you replace him now as president? Either way, you're stuck with Kamala Harris, the vice president, who actually I think would be worse than Joe Biden.
But are there also Democrats having this conversation quietly? Joining us now, Charlie Cook, founder and contributor of the Cook Political Report. Charlie, it's great to have you. I'm hearing a lot of talk about pearl clutchers and bedwetters here, but what is the real conversation, if there is one, that's happening behind closed doors? Because Democrats, the DNC, we're reporting today at Bloomberg, is now moving up potentially the nomination, the official nomination of Joe Biden to shut this down and, in fact, make him the official nominee as early as July 21st. What do you make of this moment for the Democratic Party?
Well, if I were the Democratic National Committee, or if I were the Biden campaign, I would certainly want to move it up to and shorten the game as much as I could. But, there's just an enormous amount of nervousness in the Democratic Party. But the thing is, they like Joe Biden. They don't want to be seen as undercutting him, but there's a very strong feeling that he needs to get out of the race. But there's just a real reticence for people to for prominent people in the party to publicly come out and to, offend somebody that they like, they respect, that they tend to agree with. But they are really, really nervous.
Well, and potentially you get more nervous if you see a precipitous drop in polling for Joe Biden. That's something we spoke about earlier today with Jane Hall of American University, who told us this.
They're probably going to wait for the polls and see what is the polling on this. What does the so-called average voter think? Is the damage from seeing these bites replayed in the split screen that many people were shocked by? I think even Biden's supporters. Is that the measure of the man, or can they reframe it? What should they be doing to put him out there?
And Charlie, we're starting to get a trickle of some polling that could be troubling for the Biden campaign, including a St. Anselm survey in New Hampshire that just came out after the debate finds Trump leading 44-42. Yes, that's within the margin of error, but last time they did this poll back in December, Biden was up 10 points. That's a 12-point swing, Charlie. Is that the kind of polling we're talking about that could have sway on whether he remains the nominee?
Well, I don't doubt that it swung a lot in New Hampshire over, since last December. But I think that it's how do you read a very close reading? If you're just looking at the ballot test, I don't think you're going to see as much movement as a lot of people expect, because I don't think there are going to be people that were planning on voting for Joe Biden and now they're going to vote for Trump. The danger for Democrats is people that want, they're Democrats, and they were already not enthusiastic about this election, just becoming completely demoralized and not voting at all. And that's sort of I think the biggest danger for Democrats. The Biden campaign is circulating now a poll they did over the weekend from Hart Research that showed that the ballot test basically didn't move, that Trump was still up by a couple points like he was a month ago. And that may well be. But again, it's about a demoralized party that could not just lose the presidency, because President Biden was already in tough shape there, but cost him any chance of getting the House back and maybe making the difference between losing a seat or two in the Senate and losing, 4, 5, or 6.
I wonder your thoughts on the vice president in this case, Charlie. By midnight last Thursday, we were hearing the names Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer. What does this say about America's perceptions of Vice President Kamala Harris when she's not the first person that people are turning to right now?
Yeah, the thing is, there's no shortage of talent or ambition in the Democratic Party. She was kind of a chancy choice for Biden because she ran for president at the same time he did in 2020. Her campaign didn't do very well. She didn't make it to the first primaries and caucuses. And quite frankly, the American people have just not warmed up to her. And so I don't know that she would run any better than Biden does, and that Democrats would be better off if they just went to somebody else. But I think you could find 2 dozen, 3 dozen current or recent Democratic cabinet members, governors, senators who would run far stronger against former President Trump. And just one more point, that remember the old joke about the 2 guys that were getting chased by an angry bear. And they did, you didn't have to run faster than the bear. You just had to run faster than the other guy. All someone would have to do is beat Trump, who has he along with Biden have the highest negatives of any political figures in the country. So, they may not be able to beat any other Republican, but if they could beat Trump and he has the nomination locked up, Democrats would be better off.
Well, as we talk about Donald Trump, Charlie, he, of course, was dealt a partial victory by the Supreme Court today, ruling that he has at least some immunity from prosecution for official acts as president. I won't ask you to weigh in on the extent that that was a legal win for him. But what about politically? What does it do?
Yes, I'm glad you asked it that way because I'm not a lawyer. So the thing is, I think anything that shows sort of the magnitude of what Trump was able, if you're a Democrat, the magnitude of what Trump was able to do for 4 years and what he could do for another 4 years, I think it just sort of raises the heat, the anxiety of, oh gosh, if we nominate Biden, he was probably going to lose. He was more likely going to lose before the debate, and certainly looks worse now of how bad that would be. So to me, it just sort of underscores for Democrats the stakes here that, Biden was, I was giving him about a 1 in 3 chance before the debate. And now, it's certainly longer odds than that. Democrats, it's a soul searching time. They don't want to hurt him. They like him. But at the same time, boy, they don't want to go down. They shouldn't want to go down with the ship.
Well, that says a lot coming from Charlie Cook. Charlie, we've had people come on this program since Thursday and say that Joe Biden lost the election on Thursday night. Do you agree?
No, the thing is, in the electoral, a Democrat probably needs to win the national popular vote by 3 or 4 percentage points. And he was even at best nationally because Democrats waste a lot of votes running up the score in California, New York, and Illinois, and Maryland, and Massachusetts, and places like that. Because, once you win a state by 1 vote, anything above that's wasted. You win California by 5 million votes or New York by 2 million votes. That's 7 million votes right there that don't count in terms of affecting the outcome of the race. So there was a real strong tilt against Biden to begin with, and this just made a bad situation for Democrats even worse.
All right, Charlie Cook, founder and contributor to the Cook Political Report. Thank you so much for joining us. Now coming up, more on that Supreme Court ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from prosecution in what could be, as we've discussed, both a legal and political victory. We'll be joined next by our political panel to weigh in on the impact on the campaign trail. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Remember, we didn't want King George III. And what this immunity does is exactly what the king had. And that's why we didn't create our country that way.
That was criminal defense attorney Robert McWhorter on the earlier edition of Balance of Power today, talking about history in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from prosecution for official presidential acts, effectively delaying his criminal election subversion trial in Washington until after the election. Joining us now with more is our political panel, Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Kristen Hawn, Democratic strategist and ROKK Solutions partner. Welcome to you both on this historic day. Rick, we've been characterizing this as potentially both a legal and political victory for Donald Trump. In some sense, though, could it also be a political victory for Joe Biden, as one of the primary things he is campaigning on is the health of American democracy and the future of it?
Yeah, it maybe raises the stakes a little bit. I don't think anybody idealizes the idea that Donald Trump hasn't made mistakes, hasn't violated rules in the past. He's certainly racked up quite a list of indictments over the last year. But Biden also needed just a change of topic. I mean, that guy was bleeding out of every pore over that debate. And the fact that the Supreme Court changed it to frankly, a better battleground for him, where he could go out on his number one signature issue, democracy, and talk about how, Donald Trump really is now now that we all know that presidents do have a certain level of immunity, that Donald Trump really is the biggest threat to destabilizing things. And I'm actually surprised they haven't spent more time today on this topic. I'm shocked that there aren't at least 2 or 3 former attorney generals and Democratic administrations who haven't been on all the shows talking about how important it is now to make sure that you beat Donald Trump, because Donald Trump unleashed with immunity is even worse than the old Donald Trump. But we'll see. Maybe they'll get the memo later on.
Well, this is an interesting and I think some would say counterintuitive view. Kristen, as the Democrat, your thoughts here? Does this give Joe Biden something to run with, if nothing more than a change of topic?
I mean, I think it plays into exactly what Rick was saying. I mean, this has been a core tenet of the president's campaign, which is talking about protecting democracy. I also think that, the court has been somewhat controversial over the past couple of years. First, you had the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and now you have this. And so I think that people are looking at the court, and whereas voters used to look at the court and look at it as something that was very stable, nonpartisan, now that has kind of been flipped on its head. And so it certainly becomes, if you're looking at, statements that are coming out from, Cedric Richmond, who's a co-chair of the president's reelection campaign, this is something that I think they'll continue to talk about and continue to beat that drum.
Well, we talked about the Supreme Court to Rick's point about whether former attorneys general were going to come out and talk about it. We talked with the former deputy U.S. Attorney General Donald Eyre earlier today, and this is what he told us.
Bump it up to us, and we'll tell you whether or not this poses any danger to the exercise of discretion by the president. Well, good luck with that in terms of how that's going to turn out. It's going to turn out the way 5 justices want it to turn out.
That's right.
And right now, this group doesn't seem inclined to limit the president very much.
So, Kristen, as we consider the extent to which the court will be a galvanizing force, we've talked about it a lot with the way in which they rule on, say, abortion rights. But what about just the way that they are ruling in general and questions around its ethics and reliability as an institution?
Well, and I think that's a serious question, because we've also been seeing, where you had like Justice Thomas was having to answer questions about gifts that he was taking. So it's not been a good couple of years for the court. And I think that you'll probably see more calls for taking another look at it. Should we add more justices? But certainly this is a rallying cry for Democrats who are looking at this court, who's increasingly political in their viewpoints. And I think there could be some backlash.
Backlash that probably goes nowhere. Right, Rick Davis? We've talked about this a lot of times. Something about separate branches of government kind of makes this impossible for Congress to do anything about a code of ethics or any level of conduct control for the Supreme Court, no?
Yeah, Congress doesn't govern the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court doesn't govern Congress. I mean, there are a lot of separations. And by the way, the Supreme Court's made a lot of rulings that basically took the side of Congress over the executive branch and said, no, you can't do these policies on, things like student loans and in the border without having a law in place. And the only people who make laws in this country are Congress. And so I think one of the themes that is emerging, and I know that everyone's focused on this immunity thing because it's a very big deal and it's very destabilizing to think that Donald Trump may be president unleashed. But they really have invested in both the executive branch and Congress. What they seem to lack is any investment in the court. And as Kristen was saying, I mean, they've done everything they could to make themselves look bad, with not only their ethics, but even the leaking of court documents and the, misposting of them. I mean, they just don't look like they have their act together. So maybe they ought to focus a little bit more on their own chamber and worry less about Congress and the presidency for a little while.
Coming up, Rick and Kristen will stay with us as we turn our attention to the strategy the Biden campaign is taking following last week's debate. Starting with this new ad. Take a listen.
I know I'm not a young man, but I know how to do this job. I know right from wrong. I know how to tell the truth. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
We've never had a debate where immediately after it's over, this is like a Rocky knockout. I mean, they should build a statue to Donald Trump at Georgia Tech, because everyone's talking about, should Joe Biden even stay in the race? That's never happened in our history.
Governor Doug Burgum said to be on the short list for a possible vice presidential nod from Donald Trump on Meet the Press yesterday, reacting to the presidential debate from last week. On the other side of the aisle, former House Speaker Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi spoke on MSNBC.
I'm saying to you that I support the Biden-Harris ticket. I'm not abandoning Joe Biden right now for any speculation. Biden, Harris, both of them. I'm enthusiastically supporting them, as are many of our grassroots people.
Back with us now, our political panel, Rick Davis and Kristen Hawn. Kristen, as the Democrat, you've been hearing about it since you were in studio with us on Thursday night. Your phone was blowing up that night. I suspect it's been pretty busy ever since then, too, trying to figure out not only the strategy for Joe Biden, but whether we should be talking about a different candidate. So what's the reality check on this? Is there a real conversation happening in Democratic circles about a whole new approach? Or is it time to come to grips with the presumptive nominee, Joe Biden?
I think that we need to come to grips with our presumptive nominee, Joe Biden. You see former Speaker Pelosi out there. There's a lot of support. You've seen a lot of folks, Democrats, House, Senate, all over the airwaves over the last several days. But I do think that, like I said on the show last week, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And part of that needs to be the president going out and doing unscripted interviews with reporters, showing people, that he is the right person for the job going forward for the next 4 years. He can't be behind closed doors, stay silent, and just have scripted appearances. I think that he needs to be, answering real and honest questions from people like yourselves.
Well, we'll only be talking about Joe Biden as the presumptive nominee potentially for a few more weeks. Rick, Bloomberg is reporting today that the DNC is considering formally nominating him as early as mid-July, potentially, according to our reporting, on July 21st in a virtual meeting. Is that an effort potentially to protect Joe Biden as the candidate, or to force the issue of a decision from him about whether he really wants to be?
Yeah, I think actually, when you really boil it down fundamentally, they had to do it anyway, because they were really foolish in scheduling their convention so late in August that it actually meant that they couldn't actually be on the Ohio ballot. I don't know anybody who ever plans a convention who doesn't bother checking the registration requirements for getting on the ballot in key states like Ohio. That was just crazy. So they had to do it. They were already lining up this virtual vote just to be able to qualify for the ballot. Secondarily, look, that shows you the level of panic that the Biden campaign has, that they have to actually go out and talk about the idea that, hey, we got to make sure everyone actually does vote for Joe Biden on that. Before it was a walkover, no big deal. And now it's like, we got to make sure all those voters are on there so that we have a straight shot. My view is it's actually an excellent opportunity to jam somebody else through there in his place. It doesn't really require any prep. Whoever the ultimate nominee is doesn't have to worry about getting beat up at the Republican convention, because it'll be the week after. And you have a straight shot to the election with a positive team. I don't know. Maybe these are just some ideas that the DNC ought to be thinking about if they actually want to win this election.
Fascinating. Kristen, there was some tough reporting over the weekend. Folks from Joe Biden's inner circle blaming the crew who prepared Joe Biden for that debate, beginning with Ron Klain, his former chiefs of staff, Anita Dunn, and others. John Morgan, a top Democratic donor, told the New York Times that this was basically like taking a prize fighter who was going to have a title fight. He said, quote, put him in a sauna for 15 hours and say, go fight, unquote. Are the preparers to blame, or Joe Biden?
Maybe having been a staffer myself, I tend to think that that's not a good way to go. Joe Biden's a seasoned politician. He knows what he's doing. I think, whenever you have something like a misstep like this, you're going to have people that are be pointing fingers at staff and people who are in the room, and it's easy to do that. Hindsight's 20/20, I guess. No, I don't think that's that's something that anybody should be doing.
All right, Kristen, Hawn, and Rick Davis, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining us on what has been an historic day here in Washington as we assess the aftermath of the debate and, of course, a ruling from the Supreme Court. You can get coverage of all of that, of course, in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online.
Thanks for joining. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.